Before anyone freaks out and spams the comments, survival horror didn't start with Resident Evil 1, but we'll get to that later. You may have seen my Resident Evil series on how we lost survival horror, or maybe you haven't, and in that case you should check that out for some golden rules on what a survival horror game is. But first, let's have a look at how survival horror began for the Resident Evil series, and how the genre we now know as survival horror started out. For that we have to go a little further back, but for now let's just stick with Resident Evil 1 and the Resident Evil 1 remake. In the Resident Evil world you have a choice of two characters. You can play as Chris or Jill. But in the Resident Evil 1 remake you could also play as Big Brown Box. If you thought playing as Tofu was hard, wait until you play as Big Brown Box. It's so much slower. Imagine having to run away from zombies as a box. The first thing you'll notice when you play this game as Chris, you are ill equipped to fight even the first zombie. Chris doesn't even start with a gun, so you'll have to learn very early to avoid the enemies. Even when you do get a gun, ammo is so scarce that you'll find that you will mostly have to avoid the undead. Before long this becomes a necessity, and at some point in the game you'll have to choose which enemies to kill and which to just run past. You play as a more vulnerable character compared to the zombies you're fighting, or not fighting. You must remember this is Chris before he took steroids. Back then he would run away from oversized boulders. Not like in Resident Evil 5 where, well, see for yourself. Maybe Resident Evil 1 is where Chris developed his dislike for large boulders. The term survival horror was first used by Capcom to market their 1996 release of Resident Evil. In fact, in the original Resident Evil 1, before the main menu cutscene, a title pops up saying, "Be smart, fighting foes isn't the only way to survive." And in the Resident Evil 1 remake on the GameCube, one of these titles says, "Enter the survival horror." But just because Capcom coined the phrase doesn't mean that they invented the genre. The foundation for Resident Evil 1's story, and the emphasis is on the word story, came from an earlier Capcom game made in 1998 called Sweet Home. The reason I bring up Sweet Home is because it's widely seen as the first survival horror, but not if you ask me. For me, Sweet Home is unrecognisable as a survival horror. Sweet Home is to a survival horror what a chimpanzee is to a human. There are similarities, sure, remnants of a shared past as it were, but it's a whole different beast altogether. The most important element in defining a game's genre is the gameplay. Sweet Home didn't have the gameplay of a modern survival horror because it was in 2D, with RPG style gameplay. And of course, it was a product of its time. So both visually and gameplay wise, it wasn't an influence on Resident Evil 1. Or any other 3D survival horror game. When I first played Resident Evil 1, I couldn't help but think that it all felt familiar. Long before I played any of the Resident Evil games, I played a game called Alone in the Dark. And it just so happens that this is the first true 3D survival horror game. Okay, I know. If you give me $1 for every pixel on screen now, I would have $1. But consider the other 3D games in 1992, like Wolfenstein 3D, and it isn't hard to see how Alone in the Dark won awards for its graphics. It's easy to look at Alone in the Dark now with our HD eyes and dismiss it, but there was no such thing as texture mapping back then. In Alone in the Dark though, if you look hard enough there is small bits of texturing, such as on the doors. It may be poor, but it is there. Lots of other things in Resident Evil and in other survival horror games, such as the fixed camera angle and emphasis on puzzles, were first pioneered and mastered in the original Alone in the Dark trilogy. Some examples of this would be the first enemy in the game, a hellhound, burst through the windows. Where have I seen that before? It may look primitive now, but back then I remember this being very unexpected. And even now the hellhound is pretty hard to kill, considering you don't even start with a weapon. The next enemy we meet in the attic is a zombie, which can be killed using 2 shots from the rifle you find in the trunk. or 3 shots if you're as inaccurate as me. So ammo is very scarce. But an innovation in Alone in the Dark was the fact that you can prevent almost all the enemy encounters. In the attic you can push the cabinet over to the window so the hellhound can't jump in, or you can push the trunk over the trap door so the first zombie can't come in. You can even hear the window smashing and the trap door shake to show that they're trying to get in. In some cases you can simply close doors behind you, although some of the ghouls and zombies can actually break through the doors. But pretty much Alone in the Dark was the first game where you could use your environment to set traps to block the enemy's path and avoid enemy encounters. This was never really utilised in Resident Evil 1, and just for fun I decided to try a little experiment in Resident Evil 1 by pushing this cabinet over the doorway to trap the zombie. Really quite pointless, but you could imagine how this could have been used in Resident Evil 1 as a way to avoid the enemies. And avoiding enemies is a big deal in survival horror. There are some enemies in Alone in the Dark that can't even be killed, you have to avoid them. So let's recap on some of the similarities Resident Evil 1 shares with Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark has a choice of 2 characters, one female and one male. They both take place in a mansion, although Sweet Home already had a mansion, so Capcom didn't really copy that. Alone in the Dark has puzzles just like Resident Evil, where you have to combine items in your inventory. While I'm talking about the items, think about the most iconic items you use in Resident Evil series. One that springs to mind for me is the crank. Nearly every Resident Evil game will have you using a crank at some point. Surely that's original. Nope, there was a crank in Alone in the Dark too. Exactly the same as the one you would find in any Resident Evil game. Hellhounds jumping through windows in more than one occasion in Alone in the Dark happens in Resident Evil. Okay, so Hellhounds aren't exactly the same as the Cerberus of Resident Evil, but that's only because of graphics. The fact that the enemies jump through the windows alone is a similarity. And of course there are zombies in Alone in the Dark. Yes, they are zombies. They might not look great, but they behave pretty much the same way as the Resident Evil 1 zombies. There are countless other small similarities, but I think if I go any further I'll be nitpicking. Don't get me wrong, saying that Resident Evil 1 copied Alone in the Dark probably isn't correct. Instead I should say that it improved on it. The original Resident Evil wasn't the best in the series anyway, not until the remake came along. In fact, if it wasn't for the remake, people wouldn't still be talking about Resident Evil 1 today. I know I wouldn't. The game is so gorgeous and the atmosphere is so rich that sometimes you'll forget you're playing a survival horror. After a while you begin to admire the background so much that you forget the zombie scratching at the window pane isn't just part of the scenery. And then all of a sudden, when you're least expecting it, I think the key to the remake's success is that it took what you already knew and felt comfortable with in the first Resident Evil and changed it just to surprise you. I'll give an example of this. In the original Resident Evil, when you try and leave the mansion, a cutscene will come up where one of the Cerberus will pop its head through the door, showing you that you can't leave the mansion. But as a twist, the dog actually jumps through the door in the Resident Evil 1 remake. The remake solved a problem every zombie game and indeed movie now faces ever since 28 Days Later. How do you stick to the traditional principles of slow moving zombies but still make the zombies scary and surprise you? The answer is Crimson Head zombies and camera angles. Certain zombies won't just disappear after they've been killed. This happens at random, or at least it feels like it happens at random, and in which case that's all that matters. The zombies that don't disappear will always be in the same place. They become ticking time bombs, and if you don't dispose of them properly by burning the bodies, they reanimate and become fast moving zombies. The way in which this transformation takes place is terrifying. When they do reanimate, they're like a drug addict on angel dust. completely relentless, and they seem like they have the strength of 10 men. Nothing seems to slow them down, even a shotgun blast arc to the face, which is usually enough to take out any zombie. This is how a zombie should act. Almost machine-like and completely relentless. I can honestly say the Crimson Heads are the scariest enemies in any Resident Evil game, which is an achievement in and itself. Another one of the scariest enemies prevails in the remake: the camera angles. The biggest fear in any game, and in real life, is the unknown. Nothing is more terrifying than not knowing what, if anything, is around the corner. Capcom is very good at luring you into a false sense of safety, perhaps leaving one zombie in plain sight, but hiding the other using the camera angle. This could not be achieved in an over-the-shoulder type game. It is impossible to maintain the same level of the unknown if you are in control of the camera. And when you are in control of any situation, you are not scared. Because control is the opposite of fear. Two questions remain. After perfecting a modern survival horror using an old formula, why did Capcom decide to completely turn their back on the genre and stop making survival horror games altogether? The obvious answer is money, but that's not true in this case. It is true in the case of Resident Evil 5, but that is only because of the success of Resident Evil 4. There had to be something else that drove them away to decide to create Resident Evil 4. I propose a second answer besides money, and that is the survival horror dilemma. A successful survival horror is there for you to feel uncomfortable and afraid to play the game. I can't imagine how hard it would be to convince a boardroom that you have a great idea to sell a product that makes the end user feel uncomfortable and afraid to use it. It just wouldn't happen, and it's part of the reason Hollywood will always want you walking out of the cinema happy. The final question nearly everyone who has played the Resident Evil 1 remake has asked themselves is, I wonder what Resident Evil 2 would look like if it was remade in the same way. This is something I hope to address in my next video on Resident Evil 0. I'll leave you with an awesome clip of an encounter with a chimera, one of the many cool things I didn't get a chance to talk about in this video. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for the next video.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.